Dale Rusk had been the Hardin County Extension agent for 16 years when he drove out to the Boone farm on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of April 2009. He had an appointment with Herschel Boone about a terracing plan on the south end of the property. Routine work. The kind of visit he made 40 or 50 times a year across the county. He expected to be there 45 minutes. He stayed 3 hours. Dale Rusk is 71 now. He retired from the Extension Service in 2018 and keeps a small row crop operation going with his son outside of Eldora. He will tell you, if you ask him about Herschel Boone, that what he found in that barn on that Tuesday afternoon changed the way he thought about what a working farmer knows. He says it plainly, without working up to it. "I went out there to talk about terracing," he told me. "I didn't know enough to understand what I was looking at." This is the story of what he was looking at. Most people who come across a story like this one keep scrolling before the part that matters. But if you've ever been quietly written off for doing something that made no sense to anyone around you, if you've ever just kept going because you knew something they didn't, subscribe before we go any further. Stay with us. This one is for you. Hardin County, Iowa sits in the north-central part of the state, flat corn and soybean country with some variation along the Iowa River, where the ground breaks into low bluffs and timber. Eldora is the county seat, a city of about 3,000 people, county courthouse in brick. A co-op elevator on the south edge of town that gets visible for miles on the drive in. The land around it is productive. In April, the ditches run high from the melt, and the tile lines work hard. And the farmers who have good tile drainage talk about it the way other people talk about good luck, which is to say quietly, and without inviting the subject to change. The Boone farm was 11 miles north of Eldora on County Road E65, at the end of a gravel lane behind a windbreak of Osage orange that had been planted sometime in the 1930s and had grown into a wall of it. 240 acres, corn and soybeans since the mid-1980s, a small cow-calf operation that Herschel had kept going until his back decided otherwise in 1997. The house sat behind the windbreak, and the barn sat east of the house, a 2-story structure built in the 1920s, re-roofed twice in Herschel's tenure. Tight, it smelled the way old Iowa barns smell. Old wood and chaff, and something mineral underneath that the building had absorbed over 100 years, and that no amount of empty time could take out of the timber. Dale Rusk pulled into the yard at 2 in the afternoon and knocked at the house door. No answer. He walked around to the barn. The horseshoe collecting had started, by most accounts, around 1980 or 1981. Nobody in Hardin County could put an exact year on it. It had come on slowly and without announcement, the way most of Herschel's decisions did. He drove a 1977 Chevrolet C20 in those years. Blue, one cracked mirror, 140,000 miles, and people started noticing it parked at the edges of farms when it had no obvious business being there. He would show up after a farrier's visit. He'd stop at the auction barn in Iowa Falls after a horse sale. He appeared at farms in Franklin County and Wright County under the same circumstances, and what he was asking for was the same: old horseshoes, pulled and discarded. The kind that ended up in a pile near the fence, or got kicked into the ditch. Almost everyone said yes. Because what else were you going to do with them? Arlo Fensterman, who raised hogs on 340 acres over in Franklin County and kept 2 Belgian draft crosses working into the 1990s, said he gave Herschel his first bucket of horseshoes in the spring of 1980. He figured Herschel had a project in mind. A coat rack, maybe, the kind of thing people made from horseshoes as decorations. He watched for the project over the following years. Nothing appeared in any visible form. He kept giving horseshoes anyway, because Herschel asked, and because Arlo Fensterman was not a man who said no to a neighbor's polite request if the cost was nothing. The joke took hold by the mid-1980s. It was not an unkind joke. It was the county-wide shorthand for a certain category of old iron, broken plow shanks, fence post clips, scrap chain, and especially horseshoes, and the phrase that attached to it was, "Give it to Herschel." People started saving the shoes before he asked. They'd spot a pile of pulled iron after a vet visit and set it by the fence for him. It had the quality of a minor community service. The way leaving old boards out by the road for whoever wants them has that quality. His son Darren, who had worked the farm since graduating high school in 1988 and had strong opinions about efficiency, brought it up once. He was 23 or 24, and he asked his father what the plan was behind hauling home other people's scrap iron. Herschel looked at him for a moment and said he had his reasons. Darren recognized something in that moment, not hostility, not impatience, just a specific closing of the subject, and he did not ask again. At a county extension meeting in Iowa Falls in the fall of 1994, there was a presentation on farm organization and resource management. One of the extension staff from Ames, a young agronomist named Bellman, who was new to the county circuit, made a general remark about the practice of holding old iron on farm properties, the accumulation of what he called legacy scrap, and suggested that the time and space cost of it rarely justified the salvage value. It was a broad remark, not directed at anyone in particular. Herschel was in the third row. He did not respond. He drove home that evening and backed the C-20 up to the barn and unloaded a half bushel of horseshoes he had picked up that morning at a sale in Grundy County. He had his reasons. A used horseshoe is not worth much. A horse trader named Mel Veers, who ran an operation out of Iowa Falls, did the math publicly on more than one occasion, for the benefit of anyone who wondered what Herschel was accumulating. A horseshoe ran 8 to 12 ounces. Scrap iron was moving between 8 and 12 cents a pound through most of the 1980s and 1990s, depending on the market. A bucket of 30 shoes was worth about $12 to $15 at the yard. The gas to haul it across the county was worth more than the iron. By 2009, by conservative estimate, Herschel had collected somewhere close to 800 pounds of horseshoes over the better part of 3 decades. At the scrap rate of the time, 9 cents a pound, the cumulative value of what he had picked up and carried home over those years was approximately $72. $72 was the number the county had on him. The county thought the number was the whole story. Dale Rusk went around the east side of the barn and found the door partway open. He knocked on the frame. He called in. What came back was not a voice. It was a sound he didn't immediately place. A low mechanical hum, constant, and underneath it a smell he also didn't immediately place. Mineral, hot, like a road in August, but from inside. He pushed the door open. Herschel was at a workbench along the far wall with his back to the door, and Dale Rusk stood just inside the entrance for a moment, without announcing himself, because what he saw in that barn did not arrange itself into any familiar pattern quickly enough for him to know what to say. There was a furnace, propane-fired, roughly the size of a 5-gallon pail, glowing at the center with a blue-orange flame, and a pair of long-handled tongs and a cast-iron ladle resting across the top of it. To the left, on a table covered with what looked like dark compacted sand, sat a rectangular wooden frame about the size of a shoebox, its top surface smooth flat. Along the north wall ran shelves holding iron objects, curves and angles and flanged pieces, stacked in orderly groups. And behind Herschel, covering most of the east wall from floor to a height of 6 feet, hung wooden shapes on a pegboard. Dozens of them. Each one labeled in black marker. Each in a slightly different shade of old wood, some pale, some the color of well-oiled walnut, some dark with decades of handling. Herschel turned when he heard the door shift on its hinge. He looked at Dale Rusk. He looked at him the way a man looks at a person he has been expecting to walk through the door for about 25 years. "Terracing," he said. "Yes," Dale Rusk said. He was still looking at the pegboard. "Come in then," Herschel said. The same tone as always, not warm, not cold. Just the county's particular register of practical welcome. Eldon Boone had worked at the Eldora foundry from 1947 until the plant cut back production in 1971. He was a pattern maker, which is a trade that most people have never heard of and that has mostly disappeared from the American Midwest since the 1980s. A pattern maker made the wooden forms from which sand molds were cast, the exact shapes. In wood, that would become the negative space the molten iron filled. It was precise work. A pattern had to account for the shrinkage of the metal as it cooled, typically about 1/8 inch per foot for gray iron. It had to have draft angles on all vertical surfaces so the sand would release when the pattern was drawn. It had to be built in sections for anything with internal geometry. Eldon was good at it. He worked with hand tools, mallet, chisels, rasps, calipers, and he worked slowly and without waste, which are not separate things. He kept his patterns when the plant cut back. Nobody told him not to. He had made them, and he took them. 38 wooden forms, each one built over the course of days or weeks, representing parts for agricultural equipment that was already middle-aged in 1971 and growing older. He stored them in the barn on the family property north of Eldora. He died in March of 1983 at 61 of a coronary in the cab of his Ford truck in the farmyard. He left the patterns to Herschel along with the land, though the will did not mention the patterns specifically. It didn't need to. Herschel knew they were there. Herschel had watched his father work enough to understand the process. Not at Eldon's level, not with Eldon's precision, but enough to attempt it, and to know what a failed attempt looked like, so he could try again differently. He spent 3 years after 1983 building a foundry setup in the back corner of the barn. Propane furnace constructed from a design in a 1961 issue of the American Foundryman's Handbook, which he had located at a technical library in Ames on a Saturday in January of 1985 and photocopied at 5 cents a page. Green sand mixed to Eldon's formula, which was written in pencil on an index card in the wooden box, with the patterns. Silica sand, southern bentonite clay, water, and a small percentage of sea coal. Cast iron ladles. Ingot molds for the horseshoe iron. He ran his first pour in the spring of 1986. It failed. Ran the second one that summer. It failed differently, which was progress. The third worked well enough to tell him he was on the right path. First successful casting, a cultivator sweep for an EH-183 frame that a neighbor over on E50 had needed for 2 seasons and couldn't source. Herschel gave it to him. The neighbor said it fit and ran right, and he didn't ask where it came from. Herschel did not tell anyone. He kept going. The horseshoe iron was the material. That was what needed explaining. Commercial gray iron, the alloy used for agricultural implement castings through most of the 20th century, has a carbon content between 2.5% and 4%. It is not the same as mild steel, and it is not the same as cast iron purchased in bar stock, which runs high in carbon and behaves differently at the pour. Horseshoes, particularly older ones, are made from medium carbon steel that, when melted and combined with a small percentage of pig iron, which Herschel bought in 25-pound ingots from a supplier out of Cedar Rapids at $40 per ingot, produces a mixture close enough to gray iron composition to make usable castings for light agricultural parts. Not structural components, not anything load-bearing. but cultivator sweeps and plow points and corn planter discs and clevis pins and drawbar fittings and a range of small flanged parts that agricultural equipment from the 1950s through the 1970s requires, and that nobody has manufactured commercially since the equipment aged out of dealer support. The wooden patterns on the pegboard were patterns for those parts. Eldon had made them for equipment that was already aging. He had done it well enough that the patterns outlasted the machines and the manufacturer's parts supply and 25 years of sitting in a barn in Iowa. Dale Rusk walked to the north wall and looked at the shelves. He looked at the first shelf. He looked at the second. He stood at the third shelf for a moment before he spoke. He recognized some of what he was seeing. 16 years around Hardin County farm equipment. Plowshares and cultivator sweeps he could identify. He saw both on the first shelf, stacked in groups of 4 by size. On the second shelf were disc-shaped blades, corn planter discs, he thought, though the profile looked slightly different from anything currently in production. On the third shelf, at eye level, were castings he couldn't name, flanged pieces with bolt holes cast in, asymmetric brackets with a machined face on one side, small cylindrical housings with a hex profile at one end. "What are those?" he said, pointing at the flanged pieces. Herschel walked over. He picked one up. He turned it in his hand the way a man turns something that belongs to him. Drawbar bracket. Farmall H. He set it back on the shelf. A stopped making them in 1978. Man over in Hamilton County runs 4 old H's. He goes through 3 of these a season. Been coming out here 6 years. What do you charge him? $85. Dale Rusk looked at the bracket. What does he pay if he can't get one from you? He can't get one if he can't get one from me, Herschel said. That's the point of it. There was a silence in the barn that was not uncomfortable, but was not small either. Dale Rusk walked to the pegboard. He read the labels on the patterns. Slow, left to right, top row to bottom. IT 183 cultivator sweep standard, IT 183 narrow, JD no, 71 disc, 13-inch. Farmall C rear axle cover, partial, IT 45 moldboard point, IT 45 moldboard point, IT JDB cultivator shovel, standard sweep. There were 38 patterns. He counted them twice. He turned around. How long? First good pour was March of 1986, Herschel said. 23 years. Dale Rusk looked at the furnace, which was idling at low heat, its flame visible at the base of the crucible. He looked at the sand molds on the table. One of them had a fresh pattern impression in it, waiting to be poured. He looked at the ingot molds along the wall, a dozen of them stacked, and the bars of pig iron beside them, and the wooden box with index cards on the shelf above. He looked at all of it, without moving. He said, "Does anyone know about this?" "Farmers who need parts," Herschel said. He walked to the workbench and came back with a ledger, green cover, metal corners, the kind that used to be standard at the co-op in Eldora. He set it on the workbench and opened it to the first page. March 12, 1987, 2 cultivator sweeps, IT 183 standard. Franklin County. $18. He turned pages. The entries were not crowded, 12 to 20 transactions per year, most years, some leaner, but they ran without interruption from 1987 to 2008. The same county names recurred: Hardin, Franklin, Wright, Hamilton. The same farmer names recurred. One farmer in Hamilton County appeared 17 times over 12 years. One in Wright County appeared 11 times. Each entry recorded a part, a quantity, a name, and a price. No prices were rounded. No quantities were approximate. Dale Rusk stood at the workbench for a long time. He turned pages slowly. He stopped at an entry from 2001, Farmall H drawbar bracket. 2 pieces. Hamilton County, $85 each. He stopped at another from 2004, J.D. No, 71-disc 13-inch, 6 pieces, Wright County, $35 each. 6 discs at $35 was $210. He had priced John Deere No 71 discs for a farmer in 2003 who had been looking for a set. He had found a set eventually through a salvage operation in Nebraska. They had run about $55 per disc for used ones in poor condition. He put the ledger down. He looked at Herschel. He said, "I need to write about this." Herschel looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "All right." The same tone as always. Not eager. Not reluctant. Just a man who has been doing a thing for 23 years, agreeing that the thing is what it is. The piece Dale Rusk wrote ran in the Iowa State Extension Service Agricultural Bulletin in October of 2009. It was a factual piece, 2 columns, with photographs of the pegboard and 3 of the finished castings. He described what was in the barn. He described the ledger. He named the counties and the categories of parts. He said that Herschel Boone was, to the best of his knowledge, the only active producer of pattern cast replacement parts for pre-1980 International Harvester and John Deere agricultural equipment operating west of the Mississippi, and that he had been doing it quietly and without attention for 23 years. By the spring of 2010, orders had come from 9 Iowa counties. 3 restoration operations had contacted Herschel through the Extension Office, 1 in Illinois, 1 in Wisconsin, 1 in Nebraska, after their regular parts networks turned up nothing. None of them had been able to find what they needed through commercial channels. Some of them had been looking for several years. Darren Boone drove out to the farm in November of 2009 and asked to see the barn. Herschel walked him out. Darren walked to the far wall. He looked at the pegboard. He stood in front of the furnace for a while with his hands at his sides and said nothing, which was what Herschel had always done when he was working something out, and which Herschel noticed about his son in that barn without saying so. Herschel Boone is 77 years old now. He still runs the foundry at a pace that suits him, 10 to 15 pours a year, he figures, down from more in his 60s. Lucille keeps the correspondence and the orders. The ledger is on its 4th volume. 4 patterns have been added to the pegboard since 2009, 2 of them brought to him by a retired pattern maker in Marshalltown who had read Dale Rusk's piece and drove out unannounced one Saturday in the spring of 2011 with them in the bed of his truck. He had nowhere else to put them and thought Herschel might. He was right. Nobody brings horseshoes to the farm anymore. They hear now, and they bring them without being asked. Dale Rusk drove back out to the farm on a morning in October of 2018, the fall of his retirement year, and asked Herschel could he see the barn again. Herschel walked him out. The pegboard was the same, 42 patterns now instead of 38, each one labeled in marker, each a different shade of old wood. The furnace was the same. The shelves held a new set of castings. Dale Rusk stood in front of the pegboard and looked at Eldon Boone's patterns for a while without saying anything. The ones Eldon had made were darker with handling. You could tell them from the newer 4 by the color of the wood and by the wear at the edges where decades of drawing and replacing had burnished them smooth. He stood there for a moment trying to find the right way to say it. He almost said that Eldon had been ahead of his time. That wasn't quite it. He almost said that Eldon must have known what was coming. That wasn't right either. He said, "Your father knew these would be needed. He knew what he was making," Herschel said. That was enough. Dale Rusk thought about those 2 answers on the drive back to Eldora. He decided Herschel's was more accurate. Eldon Boone made those patterns for machines that were already aging. He made them knowing the equipment would outlast its commercial parts support. knowing the supply chain would eventually move on. He made them with enough precision that his son could use them 40 years later to pour iron into shapes that no one else was producing. Not because he was planning for fame, not because he expected recognition, because he knew how to do a thing and believed that doing it right was a different category of decision from doing it at all. The horseshoes were rusted because iron rusts when it is left. Eldon's patterns were not.